All right, good morning, everybody. We're going to continue with our series on the family, and we've been looking recently at child training and seeing what the Bible has to say about that. And so this is our second message in that area, and next week we'll have yet another on child training. And really, you could go on and on and on. The more I look at this, the more there is to look at. So I just wanted to bring a couple of thoughts from last week here today as reminders. We looked at a few principles for child training. We looked at some sections of the Proverbs, a lot of training in the Proverbs, of course, for child rearing. One thing we found out that there is a need for discipline in the life of every child. Foolishness is bound up in the heart of a child. That's the truth of the scriptures and the truth of our experience too as parents. And then we found out that discipline and training is the responsibility of both father and mother. Father having the primary role as head of the house, but father and mother. Most homes, mom is home, dad's at work, and she's got things to do all day long with the children. Discipline has to be part of the role of the mother in the home. But the father and the mother together are responsible for the training of children. Now, in your marriage, that may require some discussion between the parents about how they're going to do it. They have to come to an agreement on certain things. We want to have a united front. Children pick these things up, and they know that mom's this way and dad's that way, and they find a way in to get their way. And we don't want that. We want to have a united front, a consistent pattern of discipline, and that comes from the father and the mother. Then we found out that discipline is the normal, necessary part of the life of the child. Remember the verse, reproofs of instruction are the way of life. It's just the way it is. Get over it. Things are going to happen in your life that are going to get in the way of what you want as a child. And that's just how the home life is in the family. There should be a normal, understood, necessary part of the life of the child is discipline and training. Shouldn't come as some surprise like all of a sudden you kind of kick it in or something. It ought to be just a regular part of your life. Then we looked at a really interesting passage, I think, in Hebrews chapter 12. And if you know the book of Hebrews, it's a really amazing book, talks about all these things. And then all of a sudden in chapter 12, it has a long section on child training. But it's not my child training. It describes how God trains his children, and we're his children, and he's our heavenly Father. And what does it say about him? You remember those 4 points. The Lord disciplines those he loves. That's his motivation. He disciplines us for our good. That's his objective. And it should be in our training too, parents. Child training is never merely punitive punishment. It always, always is towards a goal, towards an objective of the improving of the moral compass of the child or the betterment of his character. All of that, it has to be that way, and it certainly is for God. He disciplines us for our good, and children need to understand that what I'm doing, the way I'm doing it is for your good. And whether they understand it right then or not, it is for their good, and you know that. Then the interesting verse that says, for the moment, and this is so true, all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant. Well, that's certainly true for the one being disciplined. But what I saw in that verse is also, what does it do to the heart of God when he has to discipline his children? Do you think he just goes through it without an emotional reaction? I don't think so. God is emotional. God has feelings. I think it breaks his heart when he has to discipline his children because he wants more for them. He wants more for us. Well, it's the same thing for us. He has a commitment to that training, regardless of the outcome. I'm going to do it. And God is diligent in his training of his children, and we need to be in the training of ours as well. And then finally, what's the outcome of all of this? Oh, it's beautiful. It yields the peaceable fruit of righteousness to those that are trained by it. That's what we want. We want peace in the home. We don't want anarchy. We don't want a bunch of rogue elements running around, doing their own thing. We don't want children left to themselves. We want them trained. And we'll look more carefully at that. Now, I want to turn your attention to a couple of interesting verses in the New Testament, and they're very similar. And it's most of the New Testament, of course, all of it is really addressed to adults, to you and I. A couple of verses about young men, but these two verses are addressed to children. Ephesians 6:1, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Do you see that? It's like God's getting down on one knee and he's giving a little lecture to young people, to little children. And maybe it could be children in the home as well. Any young person under the authority of their parents. Children, obey your parents in the Lord. Why? Well, this is right. It's the right thing to do. Listening to your parents and submitting to them is the right thing to do. And it's going to benefit you. It's one of the 10 commandments. And then a similar verse, Colossians 3:20, says, children, obey your parents in all things, for this is well-pleasing to the Lord. Not only is it right on its face, it's also pleasing to God when you, as young people, obey your parents. Don't you want to please the Lord? That's one way you can do it. That's a great way to do it. And remember, it says in all things. Children, obey your parents in all things. So we can't be selective in our obedience. We can't say, yeah, I get to clean up your room, but that 9 p.m. curfew, I'm not having that. No, it has to be in all things. Why? Because they discipline you in love. Because they discipline you for your good. And so the things that they bring into your life are not just things to get in your way. They're things to train you and coach you along. So those are beautiful verses, very similar, but they bring in a lot of truth. Now we have a great example, the greatest example of what a 12-year-old boy should act like. It's Jesus himself. There's a beautiful story in the Gospel of Luke about Jesus and his family going up to Jerusalem. I think it was a large crowd, probably an extended family. They all went up there from Nazareth to worship and to offer sacrifice, whatever they were up there for. And they got it all finished, and then it was time to go home, so they all packed up and they all started going back home. Now, they didn't call an Uber or anything. They're walking, okay? So it's a big crowd. They're walking back to Nazareth. And at some point, they realize, where is Jesus? He's not with them. Now, I can tell you, and I confess, there's many times I've driven home from church without some of my children in the car. And I love fellowship. And what's wonderful is after we get home, there will be another car that comes into our driveway. But they don't even get out and say hello. They just open the back door and one of my children get out and then they just drive off. It's like, do I even know that person? A complete stranger picked him up. So my line was, when we all got in the van, I said, whoever's not here, raise your hand, because it's easy to miss somebody in the crowd. I get it. And in that whole thing, somehow they didn't know where Jesus was. Well, they turn around, they go back to Jerusalem again. Now, Jesus was wise. He's 12. You know where he went? Maybe he got separated from them. It happens. Well, he went into the temple. That'd be a safe place to go, wouldn't you? You wouldn't want to be out on the street. He knew better. He was trained, I'll bet, about what to do. So he ends up in the temple. And what's going on in there? Well, there's all kinds of discussions about spiritual things, stuff like that. So his parents, they're looking around, and finally they find him in the temple. And in a lot of depictions I've seen of this, like movies, they have little Jesus standing up giving a little sermon to all of the Pharisees and everybody that's in there. Well, that's not what the Bible says. That's just movies. When they found Jesus, they looked in there and they saw him, and it says he was both listening and asking questions. He wasn't preaching a sermon, because a 12-year-old would not do that in the presence of adults. He was taught to respect authority. He was taught to respect the wisdom of elders. And there you have it, right on display. He was asking questions, and he was listening. Beautiful, because he was trained to do that. And then it says when they finally found him and they headed back, it says concerning him and his parents, he, Jesus, went down to Nazareth and was obedient to them. That 12-year-old boy was obedient to his parents. He's the creator of the universe, but in his humanity, he's showing us what a 12-year-old should be like. He obeyed his parents. Now, let me ask you a question. In those two verses we looked at, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Children, obey your parents in all things, for this is well-pleasing unto the Lord. What's the one key word that's in both of those verses? It's obey. It's obedience. That's what we want. We want our children to obey. That's your goal and objective. Now, how do we achieve obedience in children? Wow, well, that's why we're here talking about it. There's different age groups. The way a 2-year-old obeys versus the 12-year-old would be a little different, and how you go about it as a parent would be very different. We've got different personality types. Some respond very well. Some are knuckleheads. You have to just keep working on them. But either way, there's differences. And then you got boys and girls, and we know that they're not all the same. So how are you going to do this as a parent? How do you cause your children to obey? Well, I got 4 points that I pray will be of a help to you today. One, regarding obedience and regarding parents, you have to have an intention to do it. There must be an intention. And so if you're newly married and you're going to have a family, you need to have that discussion. How are we going to do it? What are we going to agree upon? What are we going to avoid? We got to learn, we got to ask other people. I had mentors as a young father, some families in church which had children. You ask them, how do you do this? How do you do that? You have to have an intention to do it. You have to make it a priority. Proverbs 23:13, do not withhold discipline from a child. Don't do it. Don't withhold discipline from a child. When there's an opportunity there, a teachable moment, or a disobedience that needs to be rectified, don't shirk from it. You have to have an intention that I am going to train my children. And I would make it a priority, but I would also make it a prayer. Do you pray about your children? Do you pray about them obeying? You should. Sometimes we get busy in the mechanics of life and we forget to pray about the drive we're about to take. We forget to pray about the work we have to go do today. And we forget to pray about our children, the most important thing you could pray about. How about praying for yourself as a parent? Lord, help me be the father I should be. Help me be the mother that I should be. Help my children obey. Make it a priority. Make it a prayer. Intention. Well, then we have the doing of it, which I'll call instruction. There's no accountability from a child without the knowledge of what they're supposed to do. And sometimes we as parents in our busy lives, we think they know what we want, but we never really told them, or if we did, we didn't tell them very well. We just barked out an order and walked out of the room. That's not good enough. For little ones, I'll just say, having done a few of them, you have to slow down, you have to get down at their level, and you need to talk to them face to face and eye to eye. You must make eye contact. You must communicate. I know the dishes, I know, all these things are happening, but what about this little one who needs some training? You got to slow down. Moms, especially, you have to slow down and get to their level. They don't think as fast as you're talking, okay? And you make sure they know. Not only do you communicate, but they have to also understand what you're saying. So how are you going to do that? You have to ask them, what did I tell you? Let them tell it to you back. Mom, can I go out and play? Yes, you can go out, but listen, I want you to stay out of the mud. Now, what did I say? What are you going to stay out of? The mud. One more time, please. Stay out of the mud. All right, now you go out and play and have fun. You think they're going to stay out of the mud? Maybe. But at least you did your part. You communicated. All right, and now we're on our way. We're on the way to training. We're on the way to obedience because we've gotten some information out there. The next point, though, after instruction, and it is the most important point, and I hope maybe if you get anything out of this message, you'll get this, and that is what I'll call involvement. Involvement. That is leveraging your relationship with your child. How are you going to get your child to obey? You're going to leverage the relationship that you've established with them over the days, over time. Now, some of you listening to this message may have adolescent boys in your home. I've had a few. So let me ask you, I'll just address it to fathers. How well do you know these boys? Do you know who their friends are? Have you had their friends over to your house? Do you know what their interests are? Do you share in those interests? Do you have conversations with them? How well do you know these guys? Because when you're 12 or 13 and 14, it's a tricky age for a young boy, and they need a dad. They need someone who's can, invest a little bit in their life. How about you mothers? You've maybe got young girls that are growing into young ladies. They're a little awkward, They don't know if they're pretty. They don't know why their body's changing, all these other things. Are you spending some time with them in these important areas? Are you getting down and talking with them and taking them out for for a meal or something like that. This is all investments. Think of it like this, like a bank. We'll call it the bank of discipline and instruction. Okay, that's your bank. And every time you make an investment of a relationship moment with your child, bing, you're making a deposit in the bank of discipline and instruction. And you keep doing that. You keep having opportunities, having some fun with them, having fun with the things that they like. Maybe they join in some of the things that you like. All of this is involvement in their life. And that is just building up your account. You're making points, I'll say. You're building up that bank account. So when you tell your 14-year-old, I don't want you to go to the party tonight, you don't have a nuclear explosion in your living room. Why? Because you've just made a pretty big withdrawal from that bank account by telling a teenager that they can't do what they want to do. And you're not doing it because you're mean. You're doing it because you don't think that's the best thing for them to do tonight, for whatever reason. It's your reason. And you tell them that. Well, what's going to happen? They may not like what you said. They may even talk about it. They may ask questions. They may want to know. Well, go tell them. I've got some stuff I want to do with you tonight, and I think it'd be better if you stayed home. In fact, you're going to stay home. If you've got that deposit, you've got that bank account, you've still got a balance afterwards. You know, you're not broke at that point. I'll tell you, involvement with your children equates to obedience with the children. And that goes for real little ones all the way up through the ages. You've got to be parents. You have to be involved in the life of your children for them to be expected to listen to you in every situation. I had one of my daughters say that, getting on your hands and knees in 10 minutes with Magna blocks is like a 5-hour meeting. That's all they need is just a few minutes with you. I remember when we had a lot of little ones, we'd do camel rides. I'd be on my hands and knees crawling around the house, and they'd all be climbing on top. We'd be laughing, having the best time, just making deposits in that bank account. And that's what we need to do. We need an intention to train. We need instruction that's clear. We need an involvement in their life so that they care for us and they know that we care for them. And then finally, we need an intervention sometimes. Really, we need to step in and do some. I even saw a little intervention this morning during the song service. And here's what an intervention is. It's appropriate consequences for the appropriate action. Now listen, and I said this last time too, when we talk about discipline and chastening, we always think about a negative aspect of it, taking away a privilege or grounding somebody or giving the child a spanking or something like that. But it's more than that. There's a positive side to training and discipline and even chastening. And that's what we want to see. We want to see both sides of the equation, an appropriate consequence for an appropriate action. Think of it like this. Well, we had a bank of discipline and instruction. How about if you're a worker, you have a tool bag, toolbox. I have a tool bag, so I'll say tool bag. The tool bag of discipline and instruction. So you guys at work, what do you have in your tool bag? Well, you got everything you need in there. Do a little plumbing, a little electrical, whatever has to happen. You got a tool in there, hopefully, that is exactly what you need. Well, what's in your tool bag? Your instruction and discipline tool bag. I hope you have encouragement in there. Encouragement is a very important tool to have in training children. Finding something to say, good job. We talked about that last week. Good job. Encouraging them in their growth. When you see an amazing sight, you see a younger boy sharing a toy with his little brother. That's worth a moment where you say, hey, listen, I saw you do that. That's awesome that you did that. I love you for it. Encouragement. Great tool to have in your tool bag. Then we have admonishment. Admonishment's another tool I could pull out if needed. Remember the definition of that? Reproof with mildness. I like that. That's admonishment. It's when you come in and you're just telling them, you're just regulating. Listen, we have to be careful about the way we react in this situation. I saw that and I'm not happy with the way you did that. That's admonishment. Reproof with mildness. You're not coming down too hard. And again, if you have this bank account built up, it's going to work. Just that little thing is going to work. They're going to want to do what you say to do. Then you've, of course, got privileges given and taken away How about give them a privilege? If they've done something wonderful, like a little kid, say, hey, tomorrow when I go to the store, you're going to go with me and you're going to sit in the front seat. That, to them, that's everything, right? That's amazing. A little privilege or something taken away. That's another form of discipline. And then if it's serious, there could be reproof. That's where you talk seriously. You got a tone of voice and you got a way you're talking, and they're going to listen. Eye contact. Listen, don't you ever treat your family this way. That's not how we do it in our house. You reproof them. That's a tool. All of these have to be used appropriately at the right time. Is this tricky? Yes, because you can make mistakes. We'll look at that. But there's one tool that I do want to talk about. And that's the one that my Greek lexicon defined as the symbol of authority. What was that? The rod. That's how the Bible describes it. The rod, the symbol of authority. Now, there's a lot of confusion about this, and that would be basically spanking your children. Do you spank your children or do you not spank your children? It's pretty much being abandoned today for a lot of reasons. Now, I know because of who is watching, you do have to be very discreet about this, even if you live in a neighborhood. But I do want to take a minute to talk about this because it's very important. Let's listen to the Word of God before we get into it, okay? Here's a couple of verses. I mentioned the first half, but we'll add the second half of this one. Proverbs 22:15. Foolishness is bound in the heart of a child, but the rod of instruction will drive it far from him. Notice it doesn't say foolishness is bound in the heart of a child, but time out or standing in the corner or going to your room will drive it far from him. No, it won't. Not in those situations. Remember, appropriate discipline for appropriate activities. And if the rod is required, as it's called, that's what's going to drive it far from him. The Bible says that's the only thing that will. And we have to know that. Chasten thy son while there's hope. Let not thy soul spare for his crying. Proverbs 19:18. Those who spare the rod of discipline hate their children. Those who love their children care enough to discipline them. That's Proverbs 13:24 in the New Living Translation. I did like that phrase, who care enough to discipline. Do you care enough to discipline your child when they need that kind of discipline? If you don't care enough, I mean, the opposite of that is they're saying you hate your children. You don't really care about their upbringing. You don't care about their behavior. You've just given up in that area. You just don't want to do it. Don't spare for their crying. They're going to be okay. All right? God there's an anatomy thing here, you know. God gave you a little extra padding in the back and lots of nerve endings where it works without damage. Okay? Doesn't take much. Doesn't take much. Whatever your rod of discipline is, your rod of instruction, I'll say this. It has to be a known option to the child. They have to know that it's out there as a possibility. They do. It should be the exception, not the rule. This is serious business now. When you go into the bedroom, that's serious. They should know that. It has to be done properly and for the right reason. We can't discipline for the wrong reason this way. It's excessive, okay? But for the right reason, it's exactly what has to happen and the only thing that should happen. It has to hurt, but never injure. And I believe the reason for it should be made before and after. You don't just give them a swat and walk away. That's cruelty. That's not being the adult in the room. And so remember that. There's a saying we know pretty well. It almost sounds like it's in the Bible, but it's not. But maybe you remember the rest of it. Spare the rod, spoil the child. You ever heard that? Spare the rod, spoil the child. If they don't know that that's a possibility, they're going to push everything to the limits. And they do that because of who they are. All right, enough of that. Now, in child training, the ultimate goal, this is where we want to end up, is to influence and direct the will of the child. The will of the child. They have a will. I mentioned this last message. John Wesley's mother had a famous line, break the will of a child before they're 4 years old, or you never will. Well, there's a truth there, that when children are very young, they do have a will, but their will is pretty pliable at that point. It's not as set in stone as it would be later in years. So there's definitely a truth there that we need to move in quickly. I think some people have said up to 5 years old is when all of this instruction ought to happen about who the parents are and what authority means, and all this stuff can happen in the very, very early years. And I'll say one more thing about the symbol of authority. If it's used in the very early stages of childhood, when it's appropriate, not too young, of course, but not too old either, they never remember a thing. You just got some training done. Your ROI is great with that because you get some real serious work done, and there's no memory of it, and it's over. And I would say that maybe, thinking back a little bit, maybe it probably should end at some point before their teens. That would be my opinion about it. Some people have different thoughts, but I think it has to taper off as the children get a little older, because there's other things that will mean more to them than that. Notice this phrase from John Wesley's mother. She said, break the will, not understand the will. I think there's a little too much psychology going on in child training and not enough discipline. We're not going to sit here and wonder why or whatever. No, we're going to break this will because it's not what I want to see as a parent, as a father, or as a mother. Now listen to me here. Newborns and little babies have never had a limit imposed upon them, have they? Never. I'm talking about little ones, babies, and maybe a year old or something like that. Very young children and newborns never had a limit. They've never had a rule to follow, have they? They've never had a mandate that they have to obey. Never. Every need of this little person has been met instantly. If they're hungry, they're fed. If they're dirty, they get a diaper change. With all kinds of cuddly things, we talk to them and sing to them while they're all this. If they're tired, they go to bed. They're put to bed in this nice little crib with little unicorns hanging from strings, and they have a noise machine on this, just the perfect setting, and maybe a fan just wafting a little cool air over them. Okay, so they can get a little nap. They're pampered and protected, and depending on what type of diaper you use, that's literally true. So these little ones don't have a clue about obedience because they've never had to, have they? We call that innocence. Innocence. Now, I want to read a verse to you, which is directly related, although it's very hard to pull this in. It's Isaiah 7:16. You might want to write that down, look at it later. But the context here is Isaiah has a little boy, I think a little baby, or maybe a 1-year-old or something. And he has to go talk to King Ahaz about God's judgment that's coming. And God is going to use this little child as an example of how long it's going to take before the judgment comes. And here's what he says. This is God talking to Ahaz, referring to Isaiah's little boy. Before the boy knows how to refuse evil and choose the good, the two kings whom you fear will be deserted. See the truth there? There's a time in the life of a little child where they don't know anything. They have no moral compass. They don't know how to refuse evil. They don't know what evil is. They don't know how to choose good. They don't know what that is either. They're innocent in that sense. But I'll tell you what, if you impose a rule, if you say no, if you say don't touch, all of a sudden you'll find out that there's a will there. And that's what you're going to start working with, that will. It's not there until you bring in something, the law. And it's true of our life as Christians. The law makes us a certain way, makes us think about ourselves. And that law, that no or don't touch, or whatever it might be, you learn about them. A child left to himself brings shame to his mother. Covered that last time. They're not instinctive like animals. They're willful, and their will is self-centered. The choices they make are the choices that suits them best, their comfort or their happiness or whatever it might be. They're exercising their will. Now, what is the remedy to all of this? It's exactly what we're talking about. It's to require obedience, to confront the willfulness with a clear instruction regarding the right way and consequences for disobeying those instructions. It's as simple as that. We have to step in with what we want them to do, and we have to make it clear and loving that this is the way to go. And if they disobey that, maybe after another, maybe a couple of iterations perhaps, I don't know, there has to be consequences for the action, right? Sowing and reaping. And this is how the will gets turned around, how we break the will. We don't want to break their spirit, but we do want to break their will. And that's how you do it. And we have to put boundaries and limits into a child's life. We don't want a child left to himself, okay? Because something's going to go wrong if that's the case. And there's too much of that in our society. Now, I want to tell a story, a personal story that helps me to understand this, and I hope it does to you too. Just a couple of days ago, I was asked to help one of my children do some repairs in a duplex that they own. And my job description for that day was you have to replace 2 interior doors. Okay, the jam's already there. We're just going to take the door off the hinges. They got another door. We're going to line the hinges up, drill the holes, put in the screws, hang it back on the hinges. Perfect, right? It's going to work just right. Well, I got in there and did all I'm supposed to do. But you know what? Because I didn't recess the hinges, because I didn't have a chisel, I didn't have that in my tool bag, I just said, well, let's just put the hinges on the outside, line them up, it'll be good. Well, that's fine, except the hinges are about this wide, and the door has no tolerance, and so this door ended up being a little too wide. Just barely, just wouldn't quite close. Okay. All right, well, let's take it off the hinges. I'll take it outside, and I've got my circular saw here, and I'm just going to rip off just a blade's width down the hinge side, and then we'll put it back on, and everything's going to work out, right? So that's what I did. Put on my safety glasses. I snapped a little line to kind of give me a guide. I started with a circular saw, and I was as careful as I could be. It took me about 3 minutes to do 80 inches on this thing because I wasn't going to make a mistake. I'm freehanding my circular saw all the way down the length of the door. And, I got down, we brought it inside. It looks terrible. It's a terrible cut. You pulled out too early over here, so we had to take it back out, trim it a little bit, this and that. Bottom line was we got the door on the hinges, and it's shut. That's all you're looking for, right? A little caulk and a little paint makes a carpenter what he ate. But I had another door to hang, okay? So what I do on that one is what I should have done on the first one, and what I always do when you're doing a circular saw and you want to be accurate, you have to put something down there we call a rail. Well, I used the old door as a rail, clamped it down, measured it precisely to exactly what I wanted, where the blade was right where it has to be, and we clamped that thing down, and I cut this door in 10 seconds. And it was perfect. Why? Because I had a boundary. And you know what? I had no fear. I just had a light pressure on this rail. I pushed my saw through the thing all the way to the end of it. The thing fell off. We put the hinges on. Click. Perfect. Because I imposed a limit on myself. The analogy there is you don't want children freehanding their life. They have to have boundaries. They have to have a curfew maybe. They have to have instruction on how to deal with adults and how to respect authority. They have to have boundaries. And when they do, they're happy. They interviewed a lot of children who come from broken homes. And they said, what would you want more in your life as you grew up? And they all said, limits. Limits. A child left to himself brings shame to his mother. We don't want that. It's okay to put boundaries in a child's life. You have to. Don't spare for his crying. All of these verses come to bear. Listen to this, Proverbs 3, chapter 4, 3 through 5. This is Solomon talking about his father David. When I was a son, my father, tender, the only one in the sight of my mother, he taught me and said to me, let your heart hold fast my words. Keep my commandments and live. Get wisdom. Get insight. Do not forget. Do not turn away from the words of my mouth. That's what Solomon heard from his dad. limits, boundaries. Stay with me. Do the things I say. Right? It's right. It's pleasing to the Lord. Children are instructed to obey all throughout the Proverbs and the whole Bible. Children are instructed to obey because they can. They can obey. Otherwise, we're all wasting our time. And they are warned about disobeying because they do disobey. And so there's a warning there about it. And that's all part of training. Like the verse we read, there comes a time when a child can refuse evil and can choose the good if they know what it is. And that's where you come in as parents. Showing them the way, directing their paths, protecting them, guardrails from don't go there. Like I said, I don't want you to go to the party tonight. All of these things are the boundaries that a child needs. You are the responsible party to set that standard. Nobody else is going to do it, and they're certainly not going to self-discipline. Not seeing that ever happen. Some children are obviously more compliant than others, and that has to do with personality types and a whole lot of other issues. Remember the verse we closed with last week, Proverbs 29:26, is worth repeating here. My son, give me thine heart. I want your heart. I want to be on the same page with you, that when I come in with instruction, that you're with me on that, that we're working together. We really are a team in that sense, and they need to understand that. Your good intentions, your love, your objective of them being better than they are today. Give me your heart. All right, now I just have a couple of final thoughts, a couple of verses to look at as we wrap up. There are two other verses, just a little past the ones we looked at earlier, which are very similar, but they have different truths to bring out. And it's addressed to fathers, but it certainly could include mothers too, so we'll add you in there. Ephesians 6:4. We looked at 6:1. This is 6:4. Fathers, do not provoke your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. Okay, keep that in mind. And then Colossians 3:21. Fathers, provoke not your children to anger, lest they be discouraged. Similar verses, but truth there. Well, there's a warning for sure for fathers, but I'll include the mothers there too. And what is the warning? Don't provoke your children to wrath or to anger. Really, we could do that? Frankly, they can provoke me to anger if I'm not careful. But who's the adult in the room? You. You are, parents. I know it's hard. I know it's hard. You can provoke your children to anger with an excess in your discipline. You're all over them all the time. Now, again, age, personality types, all these things are details we can't get into. But in a general principle, there can be an excess in discipline. And you can just add in whatever you think into that statement. There can be an inappropriate discipline. You might be barking a reproof at them when maybe an admonishment would be better. Maybe I talked about mercy last time. Maybe the most powerful thing was what God does to us. He shows us mercy sometimes. We say, Lord, I really should have gotten it on that, but it didn't happen. Maybe in a certain situation, and I don't want to say withhold discipline from a child because that's scriptural, but maybe it's time to say, I've told you about this, and I have expectations for you that you can do the things that I want. Now, I would do this, but instead I'm going to do this. Next time around, you show me all the good that you can do there. Something. You're showing a little mercy, and you're giving some encouragement and some instruction to walk in the right way. Would you always do this? No. Would you do it sometimes? Probably ought to have that in your tool bag too. A little mercy. A little justice and a little mercy. We talked about that this morning, right? Well, we have to be like that too. So there's definitely a warning. There's a warning about that. You can belittle your child. Oh, that's easy. Yeah, you're probably going to do that again tomorrow. That's bad talk. We got to quit that. You can ridicule your child. I hear parents do that. They're just tongue lashing their children. Nobody wants to hear that. Even a little one doesn't want to hear that. So all of these things can just make the kid mad instead of obedient. And the other warning is in that Colossians passage. It says, provoke not your children to anger, lest they be discouraged. You can discourage a child by your discipline instead of building them up and looking for that objective of them being better than they are, depending on how you go about it. David brought it up in the first message on the family, a little poem. A child that hears ridicule learns to be shy. It's like you've seen dogs like that, where they've been beaten. And what are they? They're very timid. They don't even have a personality. They just cower. You don't want your children to be like that. You want your children to stand up tall and know who they are. You want them to push that saw with a rail on it, knowing that they're safe in these things when I do the things that my parents want me to do. And they learn to stand alone. That's what you want ultimately, right? Well, there's a warning, but there's also a way in this verse in 6:4 of Ephesians, and I want to finish up with that. We've touched on this a little bit in the last message, but in more detail. But we'll just gloss over it a little bit here. It says we're to bring them up. How? In nurture and admonition of the Lord. That's it right there in a nutshell. Now, nurture is the King James translation there. It's more often translated training or discipline, depending on what you're using. And that is that Greek word that we looked at last time, paideia. It's used 6 times, 4 times in Hebrews 12 that I mentioned earlier. It's also used in that verse we all memorize about the word of God is suitable for instruction in righteousness. That's paideia, instruction in righteousness. It teaches us something. But here is the other reference. The 6th reference is the nurture and admonition, or training and admonition of the Lord. Remember, paideia, that word, we think often about training and discipline as negative, but that is not just that. It's the whole training. It's the whole tool bag, everything that's in there. Encouragement all the way to reproof, all the way to the symbol of authority. It's all part of paideia. It's all part of discipline and training. And we have to do all of it. But then the next word, or they would call it then training by action. Write that down. Training by action. It's the doing of things. It's the removing of a privilege, or it's the giving of encouragement, doing something. Training by action. But then the other word is the one we haven't covered so much, and it's very interesting. It's only used twice in the New Testament. The admonition word, the nurture and admonition, that could be described as training by word. You don't always have to do something. Sometimes your tone of voice is all that's needed. Training by word. And it's used in that sense. And one Trench, a Greek author, said, by the word of encouragement, when this is sufficient. Also by that of reproof, of blame, where those may be required. You have to make that decision, parents. Which one am I going to do? How am I going to speak to them? How forcefully am I going to speak to them? We have to control ourselves sometimes. So this is the way. The way is to bring them up in the nurture and admonition, the discipline and admonition of the Lord. Ultimately, we are preparing and equipping our children to live in a world that's often against the things of God and opposite of all that is right and good. That's the world we're living in. And so we have to prepare these little ones to live in that world. Don't be afraid of your children. Don't say, well, I'm not going to have any children because this world is so bad. Listen, every parent has had to deal with this in one way or the other. We train our children to prosper and survive in a world like this, to excel in a world like this. We have to train them in that good and right way, and that requires intention and diligence and wisdom, and most importantly, dependence on God, on His grace. People ask me all the time, and my wife, how did you ever raise all those children? I don't know. By the grace of God. That's all I can say. Lots of mistakes, lots of successes. The grace of God just washes over you as you're trying to train your children. One last verse to leave us all with in my little section of child training, and David will be picking it up next week as well. Proverbs 23:24. Let's end on a happy note, huh? The father of the righteous shall greatly rejoice, and he that begetteth a wise child so they'll have joy of him. We want wise children. We want to rejoice in our children and not to have them bring us sorrow. And we can do that by being diligent in our training in all the ways that we've covered today. May God be blessed in helping us to make these little arrows straight so they can go out and accomplish what God wants for them.